unthinkable just happened. 1 minute ago, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom was placed under arrest inside a packed courtroom, and the entire nation is now spiralling into absolute chaos. This is not a movie. This is not a nightmare. This is real life happening right now, and it's the biggest political earthquake Britain has seen in 300 years. The most powerful person in the country, the man who controls the government, the military, the intelligence services, is now in police custody, facing criminal charges so serious they could put him in prison for the rest of his life. Parliament is in meltdown. The streets are exploding with protests. The royal family is in emergency meetings. And the whole world is watching in absolute shock as British democracy tears itself apart in real time. Everything you thought you knew about how government works, about who's really in charge, about whether justice can touch the powerful, is about to be completely shattered. What you're about to hear will blow your mind and change how you see politics forever. The Royal Courts of Justice became the centre of the universe exactly 60 seconds ago when police officers walked up to the Prime Minister and told him he was under arrest. Let that sink in for a moment. The leader of the United Kingdom, the person who sits across from the King, who commands Britain's armed forces, who represents the nation on the world stage, was just handcuffed and taken into custody like any common criminal. The courtroom erupted into absolute pandemonium. Lawyers were shouting, security guards were moving into position, reporters were frantically typing on their phones trying to break the news first, and the Prime Minister himself looked like he'd been hit by a truck. His face draining of colour as the reality of what was happening finally crashed down on him. For months, he'd been arrogant, dismissive, absolutely certain that his position would protect him from consequences. He'd laughed off the allegations, attacked the investigators, used every trick in the political playbook to avoid accountability. But none of that mattered anymore. The judges had seen the evidence and they decided that nobody, absolutely nobody, is above the law in Britain. The charges are so explosive they read like something from a crime thriller, except this is all documented, all proven, all ready to be prosecuted in what will be the biggest trial in British history. We're talking about corruption on a scale that makes previous political scandals look like parking tickets. The Prime Minister allegedly accepted massive illegal payments from foreign governments and wealthy criminals in exchange for changing British policies to benefit them. We're talking millions of pounds flowing into secret bank accounts, into properties bought through shell companies, into luxury lifestyles that no politician could afford on their official salary. And in exchange for these bribes, Britain's foreign policy was twisted to serve foreign interests instead of British ones. Defence contracts worth billions went to companies connected to the people paying the bribes. Immigration rules were quietly changed to benefit certain countries. Intelligence was allegedly shared with nations that had no right to access British secrets. This isn't just corruption. This is betrayal of the most fundamental kind, selling out your own country for personal profit. But it gets worse, so much worse. The second set of charges involves abuse of power that would make a dictator blush. The Prime Minister allegedly turned Britain's security services into his personal secret police, ordering them to spy on journalists, investigating his corruption, to dig up dirt on political opponents, to intimidate whistleblowers who tried to expose the truth. Former intelligence officers are now coming forward with horrifying stories about orders they received that had nothing to do with national security and everything to do with protecting the Prime Minister's criminal activities. Opposition MPs found themselves under surveillance, their phones were tapped, their families were investigated, damaging information about their private lives mysteriously leaked to friendly newspapers right when they were causing problems for the government. Journalists who got too close to the truth had their sources exposed, their homes raided, their careers destroyed. This is the kind of thing that happens in authoritarian states, not in democracies with centuries of tradition protecting civil liberties. But it happened here in Britain, ordered by the man who was supposed to be the guardian of those liberties. The obstruction of justice charges might actually be what puts him away for good, because they show he knew exactly what he was doing and worked desperately to cover it up. When investigators started closing in, the Prime Minister and his inner circle went into full criminal mode. Documents were shredded. Computer hard drives were destroyed. People who knew too much were offered jobs in other countries to get them out of Britain where they couldn't be questioned. Witnesses were threatened. Some were allegedly bribed to change their testimony or suddenly develop memory problems. The Prime Minister personally lied under oath in early proceedings, claiming he had no knowledge of illegal donations, when prosecutors now have recordings of him discussing those exact donations in detail. He coordinated alibis with co-conspirators, held meetings in locations without security cameras, used burner phones and encrypted apps to discuss the cover-up. Every single action screams guilty conscience, screams knowledge of wrongdoing, screams panic about getting caught. And now he has been caught, the evidence is overwhelming, and the judges decided they'd seen enough. The actual moment of arrest was something nobody who witnessed it will ever forget. The senior judge, one of the most respected legal minds in Britain, looked directly at the Prime Minister and said the words that changed everything. Based on evidence presented to this court, including materials obtained this morning, we have probable cause to believe serious criminal offences have been committed. An arrest warrant is hereby issued. The Prime Minister actually tried to argue, tried to claim this was unconstitutional, tried to assert some kind of executive immunity. But British law is crystal clear. There is no immunity for criminal acts. The Prime Minister holds office at the pleasure of Parliament and the people, not as some kind of monarch above the law. Two police officers moved forward, professional and calm. Despite the historic nature of what they were doing, they told him to stand. He hesitated, looking at his lawyers as if they could somehow magic him out of this situation, but there was no escape. The officers placed handcuffs on his wrists, the metal clicking shut with a sound that echoed through the silent courtroom. They recited his rights in clear, measured tones. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defence if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court. The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom was being arrested and the world was watching every second of it unfold. News of the arrest spread faster than anything in modern British history, exploding across social media at lightning speed, before traditional news organisations could even process what had happened. Within 5 minutes, it was trending #1 worldwide on every platform. Within 10 minutes, news channels across the globe had interrupted their regular programming with breaking news alerts. Within 20 minutes, thousands of people were already descending on central London, and that number was growing exponentially. The scenes outside the Royal Courts of Justice and spreading throughout Westminster are absolutely chaotic, with Britain's deep political divisions manifesting in angry crowds that are growing more volatile by the minute. On one side, you have people celebrating, literally dancing in the streets, popping champagne bottles, chanting that justice has finally been served and that corrupt politicians are finally facing consequences. These are people who've spent years watching the elite get away with everything, who've been told the system is rigged, who desperately needed to see that accountability is still possible. For them, this arrest is vindication, proof that Britain hasn't completely lost its way. But on the other side, you have furious supporters of the Prime Minister who believe this is a coup disguised as legal proceedings, a conspiracy by judges and prosecutors who want to overturn the results of democratic elections. They're screaming about political persecution, about the deep state taking down an outsider who threatened their comfortable arrangements, about this being the death of democracy itself. Some are claiming the evidence is fabricated. Others are arguing that even if the Prime Minister did these things, his political opponents have done worse and gotten away with it. So this is selective prosecution driven by bias. The two groups are separated by police lines that are looking increasingly fragile as more people arrive and tensions escalate. Officers in riot gear are forming defensive positions. Mounted police are being deployed. Water cannons are on standby. London hasn't seen this level of civil unrest in decades, and there's genuine fear that this could turn violent if the situation isn't carefully managed. Parliament has been recalled in emergency session, and the scenes inside Westminster are almost as chaotic as the scenes outside. The Deputy Prime Minister, thrust into leadership by the arrest, gave a brief statement trying to calm the situation, but her words satisfied nobody. She claimed the government continues to function, that Britain remains stable, that the legal process must be allowed to proceed without political interference. But MPs from all parties were shouting questions, demanding answers, accusing each other of being complicit in corruption or complicit in a political witch hunt. The Speaker of the House had to suspend the session twice because the noise and disorder made it impossible to conduct any actual debate. Behind closed doors, frantic meetings are happening as constitutional experts try to figure out what the rules even are in this unprecedented situation. Can a Prime Minister continue to hold office while facing criminal prosecution? Can they access classified information while under suspicion of having shared secrets with foreign powers? Who makes these decisions, and what happens if different parts of the government disagree? The charges themselves are being examined in forensic detail by legal analysts, and the consensus is that the prosecution has an incredibly strong case built on thousands of pages of evidence collected over months of investigation. The foreign bribery allegations centre on 3 specific countries whose governments allegedly paid the Prime Minister to influence British policy in their favour. Country A, according to prosecutors, paid £5 million through intermediaries in exchange for Britain supporting them in international disputes and providing access to advanced military technology. Country B allegedly paid £3 million to get favourable visa arrangements for their wealthy citizens and to prevent Britain from imposing sanctions over human rights abuses. Country C supposedly paid the most, over £10 million, to secure massive defence contracts and to influence Britain's position in trade negotiations. Each payment is documented through bank records, shell company filings, property transactions and testimony from people who facilitated the transfers. The evidence includes the Prime Minister's own signature on documents authorising the very policy changes that benefited these countries right after the payments were made. The surveillance and abuse of power charges are backed by testimony from intelligence officers who were ordered to conduct operations they knew were illegal but felt they couldn't refuse without destroying their careers. One former MI5 officer described being told to monitor a journalist's communications and report on their sources. When he objected that this had nothing to do with national security, he was told that protecting the government from embarrassment was now part of the security mandate. He complied, but kept detailed notes about what he was ordered to do, who gave the orders and when. Those notes are now evidence. Another witness described a meeting where the Prime Minister personally reviewed surveillance reports on opposition MPs and discussed how to use the information against them politically. A third witness, a police officer, described being pressured to drop an investigation into financial irregularities involving the Prime Minister's family members. When she refused, she found herself transferred to a remote posting and passed over for promotion. These patterns of abuse paint a picture of a leader who saw the entire apparatus of government as his personal tool for maintaining power and crushing anyone who threatened him. The obstruction charges are perhaps the most damning because they include recordings of the Prime Minister discussing the cover-up. Investigators recovered encrypted communications that the Prime Minister thought had been permanently deleted. In these messages, he discusses destroying evidence, coordinating false testimony, and paying people to leave the country before they could be questioned. One message explicitly says we need to make sure the documents about the overseas payments never see daylight, with the Prime Minister himself suggesting they be burned. Another discusses offering a potential witness a lucrative job abroad, with the Prime Minister writing, "Get him out of the country permanently and make sure he knows what happens to people who talk." This isn't circumstantial evidence that requires interpretation. This is the Prime Minister's own words, proving he knew crimes had been committed and actively worked to prevent justice. Any ordinary person with this evidence against them would be looking at decades in prison, and prosecutors are making clear they'll seek the maximum sentence if convicted. The international implications of this crisis are absolutely staggering, and world leaders are scrambling to respond to a situation nobody ever imagined would actually happen. Britain's closest allies are in emergency mode, trying to figure out what this means for intelligence sharing, military cooperation and diplomatic relationships. The United States has reportedly suspended certain classified briefings to UK officials until they can assess whether British security has been compromised by a Prime Minister who allegedly sold access to foreign powers. NATO headquarters is conducting an urgent review of whether sensitive alliance information might have been leaked. The Five Eyes intelligence partnership between the US, UK, Canada, Australia and New Zealand is in crisis talks about whether Britain can remain a full member while its leader faces charges of sharing secrets with hostile nations. These aren't just theoretical concerns. If the allegations are true, Britain's most important strategic relationships have been poisoned, and it will take years to rebuild the trust that's been shattered. European leaders are watching with a mixture of shock and barely concealed satisfaction, seeing this as validation of their warnings about British political instability since Brexit. French president has released a statement expressing concern for the British people, while noting that strong democratic institutions and rule of law are essential. A subtle dig suggesting Britain's institutions are neither strong nor functioning properly. Germany's Chancellor was more direct, saying this crisis demonstrates the dangers of populist leadership and the importance of robust checks on executive power. These comments are infuriating British patriots who see them as opportunistic point scoring while the country is in crisis. But they're also resonating with many Britons who are genuinely questioning whether their political system is broken and whether the country needs fundamental reforms to prevent this kind of corruption from happening again. The debate about Britain's place in the world, about whether Brexit was a mistake, about whether the country needs to rejoin European structures, has been reignited with new intensity. Back home, the practical questions about governance are becoming urgent and nobody has clear answers. The Deputy Prime Minister is technically in charge, but she's part of the same government that's now been exposed as corrupt to its core. Does she have legitimacy to make major decisions? Should there be an immediate general election to let voters choose new leadership? Can the arrested Prime Minister still technically hold office while fighting criminal charges? Or does arrest automatically trigger removal? Constitutional scholars are giving conflicting opinions because Britain's unwritten constitution relies on precedent and convention, and there's simply no precedent for this situation. The closest comparison anyone can find is from centuries ago when monarchs faced legal challenges, but even those cases don't provide clear guidance for today's crisis. Parliament might need to pass emergency legislation to clarify the rules, but Parliament itself is paralysed by partisan warfare, with each side trying to exploit the crisis for political advantage. The legal process moving forward is going to dominate British news for months or possibly years. The Prime Minister has been taken to a secure police facility for processing, where he'll be fingerprinted, photographed, and held in a cell overnight like any criminal defendant. His lawyers are already filing emergency appeals trying to get him released, but prosecutors are preparing arguments for why he should be denied bail. They'll argue he has access to government resources that could help him flee the country. They'll argue he has motive to intimidate witnesses or destroy additional evidence. They'll argue that someone who allegedly used state surveillance apparatus against enemies cannot be trusted to behave lawfully while awaiting trial. If the magistrate agrees and denies bail, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom will be remanded to prison, locked up in a cell, stripped of his freedom. The image of that happening would be the most stunning visual in British political history, and it's a real possibility that could come as soon as tomorrow. The political fallout is already reshaping the entire landscape of British democracy. The Prime Minister's party is tearing itself apart, with some members defending him as a victim of persecution, while others are desperately trying to distance themselves from the scandal.